All right, greetings everyone. Thank you so much for joining me for our last video in Module 4, which provides an introduction to survey research. So in this particular video, I am going to take you guys through a bit of a tutorial about writing good survey questions. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so what I'm going to do for this tutorial is I'm going to show you some example questions that we might include in our survey measuring self-concept clarity in individuals interested in joining a sorority and individuals not interested in joining a sorority. So I'm going to show you a particular item that is problematic, and I'm also going to talk about how to fix that item. Okay, so let's suppose that one of the questions we chose or that we created was belonging to a Greek organization increases my chances of being successful, right? So based on the title of the slide, I'm sure you've concluded, right, that the problem with this question is vague, unclear, or confusing wording, right? So what word in this particular question do you think is vague or unclear? Okay, so if you said successful, you are correct. Okay, so better items that more clearly define successful for our respondent might include belonging to a Greek organization increases my chances of graduating with honors. Okay, so that's an indice of academic success. We could also talk about maybe social or relational success. So I will make more friends if I join a fraternity or sorority, right? So both of these questions attempt to capture potential ways that joining a sorority or Greek organization might help you satisfy your particular objectives that you want to achieve while in college. Okay, another really important thing that you will want to avoid is unfortunately something that is really common in just about every survey that you see on the news, and that is the double-barreled question. So what does that mean? Well, let me give you an example, right? So let's look at this item. Joining a fraternity or sorority will help me meet my academic goals and meet others with similar goals. Right? So keep in mind, right? We are using a scale to measure our measure participants' responses, right? So if they have to answer, yes or no, if it was a forced choice scale, or their agreement with a statement from 1 to 7 or 1 to 5 or what have you on a Likert scale, they can only give one response, right? So what if they believe that joining a Greek organization will help them meet others with similar goals, right? But they don't believe joining a Greek organization will help them meet their academic goals. Well, if they have a yes answer to one of the components of the question and a no answer to the other component, then how do they accurately convey their response, right? So an improvement would be to ask two separate questions. Joining a Greek organization will help me meet my academic goals. Do you agree? And joining a Greek organization will help me meet others with similar goals. Do you agree? On a scale from 1 to 5 or whatever. Okay, and this is true of certainly of scientific writing, and really any time that you write something, is that you want to avoid jargon or terminology that might be unfamiliar to your respondents or your audience. Okay, so rushing a sorority will help me make friends, right? So those of you who have joined Greek organizations or maybe seen movies about Greek organizations, people in fraternities and sororities, you might know what rushing a sorority means. But there might be some of your respondents that have no idea, right? So a better option would be going through the sorority selection process will help me make friends, right? Because then you've clearly defined all of your terms for your respondents. On a related note, avoid unnecessarily complex language, right? So, and I just want to be clear, I did not write this question, and this question does not reflect my beliefs at all on the subject, but it's just an example question. Fraternities and sororities are for obtuse students who distinctly lack erudite qualities. Right? So that's a lot of big words. So a better item, again, I'm not endorsing this item, might be fraternities and sororities are for simple-minded students who lack intellectual qualities. Right? Again, not saying this is true in the slightest, but it is a clearer question. Right? Okay, we also want to avoid something called response set bias. Okay, so response set bias or response set is when questions are phrased in such a way that participants with a positive view of Greek life will agree with the statements, right? Whereas someone with a negative view of Greek life will disagree with the statements, right? So if all of your questions are phrased that way, where a higher rating on the scale means more of something and a lower rating on the scale means less of something, then what will happen is a participant will give the same answer to most, if not all questions, no matter what they're asking, right? So if your respondent catches on and said, okay, I'm pro sororities or fraternities, they might just circle very interested for all of the questions without actually reading them and giving an individual assessment to each item, right? So how do we avoid this, or how do we correct for this? Well, let's look at an example, right? So we have fraternities and sororities are a good way to spend my free time, right? So this item would again merit a higher response on the 1 to 5 scale if you agree with that statement, right? So how do we write this question in such a way that it's the opposite, right? So that maybe now the participant who agrees with this statement might give something like a lower rating, right? So there's not that trend to keep giving 5s over and over and over again. Well, you would just use the opposite wording, right? So a better item might be fraternities and sororities are a waste of time, right? So people who are in favor of joining a sorority would now select 1, which is strongly disagree, or select strongly disagree, right? But it does impose kind of a challenge, right? So if we want to simply and quickly sum up a participant's responses, right, to get a score, and we want the score to be simple to interpret, so we want a higher number to mean that our respondent exhibits more of the trait, or that a higher score would indicate that our respondent is in favor of joining a sorority. Then doing this opposite question here might make that harder. But fortunately, there's an easy way to fix that, right? So the standard measurement that we have, right, with our Likert scale is that a 5 is equal to strongly agree, a 4 is equal to agree, a 3 is equal to neither agree or disagree, a 2 is equal to disagree, and a 1 is equal to strongly disagree. right? So if we want a higher number to indicate a positive view of sororities, all we would have to do is reverse that, right? So now if a respondent strongly disagrees with the statement, that means they're higher in our trait, right? That means that they have more of our construct, or they're more likely to join a sorority. So what we could do is something called reverse coding, right? So now for this particular item, a 5 would be equal to strongly disagree. A 4 would be equal to disagree. A 3 would be neither agree or disagree. A 2 would be agree, and a 1 would be strongly agree, right? Because if you strongly agree or agree that fraternities and sororities are a waste of time, then you're going to be lower on our trait or construct that we're measuring. Okay. Another thing that you want to avoid is double negatives or naysaying, right? So you don't want to just add a not in there, right? So our original question was trying to assess whether our respondent believes that fraternities and sororities are a good way to spend their time, right? So we wouldn't want to write a question that was something like, not joining a sorority is not a waste of time, right? Not joining a sorority is not a waste of time. Or, for example, if we were measuring whether our respondent believes that that they will make friends by joining a sorority, right? Then an item like not joining a sorority will not help me make friends, right? So that's called naysaying, is when we have double negatives in there, which are confusing or difficult to answer, right? So not joining a sorority will not help me make friends, right? That's very confusing, right? So we would want to phrase it like, joining a sorority will help me make friends, or joining a sorority will not help me make friends, right? Rather than having the double negative in there, okay? Okay. So I just wanted to show you again the reverse coding. So again, fraternities and sororities are a waste of time. In our original set of values, 1 equals strongly disagree, right? But if we were to do the reverse coding, now a 5 would be strongly disagree, right? So essentially what we're measuring with the numeric values is the degree to which our respondent possesses the trait we're measuring, or the degree to which our respondent wants to join a sorority, right? So in that scheme, right, having a higher number should equal more of that trait, or a stronger desire to join a sorority, right? So if we have something like fraternities and sororities are a waste of time, somebody who who is interested in joining a sorority would show a lot of disagreement to that statement. So the option to disagree or strongly disagree should be linked with a higher numerical value. Okay? Alrighty, so now that I've gone through a couple of examples of potential survey questions and how to improve them, I'm going to talk about some other things that you might want to be aware of if you're writing or evaluating survey questions. Okay, one thing you want to avoid is something called a loaded question. So there are basically two defining features of a loaded question. So a loaded question, number one, is going to attempt to constrain your respondents or force them to respond in a particular way. Okay, so loaded questions are going to kind of try to lead your respondents to a particular answer rather than asking them about their actual opinion. So that's one feature of a loaded question. The second feature of a loaded question is a loaded question is going to contain a controversial assumption. Okay, so again, loaded questions attempt to lead respondents to answer in a particular way, and they also contain a controversial assumption. So let me give you an example. This is a question that I saw on an online survey like maybe 2 weeks ago. And the question was phrased like this. So the question stated, do you think that people should be allowed to not wear masks, thereby endangering the entire population and causing them to die of coronavirus, right? So we see both features here, right? There's a very obvious answer that they are sort of garden pathing their respondent to give. And there's also a very controversial assumption there, right? So those are loaded questions. And something related that we want to avoid is the use of inflammatory language, right? So what do I mean by inflammatory language? I mean language that is likely to incite a lot of negative emotions, okay? So for example, a question like, do you think loud, obnoxious people should be allowed to talk on their cell phone when riding an elevator, right? So again, obviously the inflammatory words there would be loud and obnoxious, right? So, or any other descriptor that you might see, loud, obnoxious, rude, lazy, anything like that, anything that is likely to incite a lot of negative emotions. Something else we want to avoid is making particular assumptions about what our participant knows or how our participant behaves. So a lot of the worst survey questions make the faulty assumption that their respondent has access to the same knowledge that they do. Right? So maybe you are conducting a survey about respondents' opinions regarding gun violence, right? So as a psychology major, you might want to ask them, do you think that the biopsychosocial model is the best way to explain gun violence, right? Very good question, right? But it's very, very unlikely that anyone who is not a psychology major or someone with extensive knowledge of psychology, it's likely that they will not know what that is. So you definitely want to avoid assuming that your respondent has access to knowledge. You'd also want to avoid saying or asking things like, what did you think of Joe Biden's speech, or what do you think of his views about this issue, right? Because again, your respondent might not be aware of what Joe Biden's position is or what he said in a particular speech. Okay. These next two might seem fairly obvious to you, but one of the other sort of hallmarks of a bad survey is just kind of carelessness. So for example, you want to make sure that whatever question you ask on your survey is going to have the appropriate response categories if you are using close-ended questions, right? So for example, if you are trying to evaluate how frequently someone engages in a behavior, right? So I feel sad, right? If you want to know or if you want to know maybe how much, let's think about maybe how often do you watch television? Right? So if that's your question, and then your response categories are a 5-point scale that ranges from strongly disagree to strongly agree, right? Then your respondent isn't going to be able to answer that question in a meaningful way. So you want to make sure that whatever question you're asking, if it's a closed-ended question, you include the appropriate response scale. And the related issue is you want to make sure that if you're asking a closed-ended question, that your response categories are not mutually exclusive, right? So let's say you're doing a survey of driving behavior, and you want to ask people how much money they spend on gas per week, right? So you don't want your response categories to be $0, less than $30, $30 to $40, $40 plus dollars, or $40 or more, right? Because if you spend $40, your response could be between $30 and $40 or $40 or more. So you want to make sure to have response categories that are clearly delineated categories where there's no overlapping. Okay. The last thing you want to avoid, which I think I've talked about this before, is something called determinism. So you want to avoid, for example, using words like always and never, because nothing in our lives, right, whether we're assessing our personality characteristics or psychopathology or attitudes or what have you, very few of the constructs that we're interested in measuring or the questions we're interested in asking are that concrete, right? So there's naturally going to be a lot of variation and fluctuation in most of the constructs that we're looking for. So you never want to ask a respondent whether they always or never do something. You want to allow for a more nuanced response category that incorporates more fluctuation or variability. Okay, so avoid determinism. Make sure your response categories don't overlap. Make sure that your response categories match the question. Don't assume prior knowledge or behavior on the part of your respondent. Don't use emotionally arousing words. And don't make assumptions or try to lead, don't make controversial assumptions, and don't try to lead your respondents to answer your question in a particular way. Okay, so these are some of the most important things you're going to want to avoid when you're creating survey questions, or things that you'll want to be aware of if you're evaluating the merit of a particular survey question. Okay, so continuing our discussion of survey questions, here's a couple of things you might want to consider also when you're creating a survey. The first thing is social desirability bias. So social desirability bias occurs when a respondent is driven to give a response that is socially acceptable or will protect them from the possibility of judgment on the part of the experimenter or on the part of anyone reading his or her response, right? So this is particularly true if you're asking about controversial topics, right? So for example, if you're talking about use of illegal substances, if you're talking about taboo behaviors, such as cheating on an exam or stealing, or something like that, right? Something controversial that could potentially make the respondent be viewed in a negative light, right? That is a situation where you might encounter social desirability bias. right? So what do you do to overcome social desirability bias? Well, the most important thing you can do to ameliorate this is simply to impress upon each respondent that their responses will be entirely anonymous, right? So remember from our discussion last week of different types of harm that we want to avoid in an experiment. Anonymity means that at no point is identifying information included with your assessment, right? So at no point do you have access to the participant's name or any identifying information, right? So certainly you would want your survey to be anonymous, and you would want to emphasize to your respondents that they will not, be able to link their identity with their responses. The other thing is demand characteristics. So demand characteristics happen when respondents or participants develop a hypothesis as to what your survey is asking them about, and then they try to respond in the way that they think you as the researcher want them to respond. Okay? So the way that you would solve that issue is you would include what are called distractor items. So these are questions on your survey that have nothing to do with what you're actually measuring, but they're kind of used to deceive the respondent a little bit, so that they're not able to deduce what your actual hypothesis is in your research, and then try to respond accordingly. Okay. The other thing you want to consider, particularly when administering your surveys, is response rate, right? So that's one of the biggest challenges in survey research, is we can send out, mail out or electronically send out thousands and thousands of surveys, but chances are only 30 to 40% of our respondents are actually going to return them. So one of the things we have to consider is, how are we going to administer the survey? Are we going to do it over the phone or in person, on social media, via email, okay, to get the highest response rate? And we also have to consider the potential biases that might develop as a result of our response rate, right? So for example, if you conduct your survey on the phone from the hours of 9 a.m. to 5 a.m., chances are the people that answer the phone and do your survey might all be retired people, or people who are out of the professional work sector, and so their responses might be very different from other proportions of the population, right? So your sample might not be representative. Similarly, if you conduct your survey over social media, you might be more likely to get responses from people between the ages of 18 and 24, because that's the demographic that is most comfortable with social media, right? So you might get a lot of young people's perspectives, but not necessarily get a true representative sample of people with from a variety of age groups. Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to go back to distractor items really quick. Again, these are questions that we include in a survey scale to purposefully mislead participants as to the true purpose of our scale, right? So for example, being a member of Student Government Association will help me improve my leadership skills, or joining a sports team is a good way to meet new people on campus, right? So these items, if we were to add them to our scale, would maybe lead our respondent to believe we were just interested in how interested students are in a variety of campus organizations, maybe for recruitment purposes. Okay, so the last thing I want to show you is the actual results and how we might write those up if we were preparing a manuscript or something like that. So as it turns out, there is a statistically significant positive correlation between one's self-concept clarity and their attitude toward Greek organizations, right? So our Pearson R is 0.64, which is quite a strong correlation. And we interpret based on those statistics that those who have a higher self-concept clarity tended to have more of a positive attitude toward Greek organizations. Okay, so I hope this video was helpful. It'll be especially important for you to watch this video before Thursday's lab. So I look forward to seeing all of you then, and I hope you have a wonderful week.